All right, so jumping into the mid-year presentation, of course, I would begin by just acknowledging that we're in our 20th anniversary year. Of course, on September the 28th, this year, we had the opportunity to celebrate this very important milestone, to reflect on 2 decades worth of achievement that since we've been in operation, but also to look forward as to what's going to happen down the road. So some of the slides that I'm going to speak to over the next little while they contain data to update the board on performance for the first 6 months of the year, they also reflect trends that go back a little bit longer, just to reflect some ongoing performance issues. As Mel said in his remarks, of course, we were launching the new brand at the same time as our 20th anniversary. We had the major launch in September, and Ron will update us on the status of the launch since then. But to reinforce the points that Mel said, what our brand very importantly does is signify the areas of focus that this organization is engaged in: blood, plasma, stem cells, organs, and tissues. The colors reflected in the symbol and in our brand demonstrations reflect those various very important life essentials, and we will remain very focused on fulfilling this brand, both as it supports the mission, vision, values, operational pillars, and quality policy of the organization, as it does help us in the arena of donor recruitment and retention. At the same time as launching the brand, we also launched the next strategic plan for Canadian Blood Services, and the board will remember you've been heavily involved in working with us on developing the strategic plan, which is entitled Keeping the Promise, and this is the plan that takes us into the next 5 years, so 2019 through to 2024. And just to remind the board and the members of the public that this plan was developed with very extensive consultation, including broad consultation across the country, with stakeholders, with groups of interest, with physicians, healthcare providers, government officials, funders of healthcare systems. There was a very broad subject matter expertise internationally. There was a very broad array of input into the development of this strategic plan. And these are the 5 key focus areas. I'm not going to read them here, but essentially this plan will begin to take life in April 1 next year, and we're now in the phase of having developed the strategic plan. We're now in the phase of doing the work on identifying what are the key priorities, the key projects and programs that we will need to launch over the next 5 years to, in fact, deliver on the promise contained inside the strategic plan. So, of course, we will come back to this repeatedly over the next 5 years, including framing how we have all our discussions at the board around the 5 key focus areas that underpin the plan. So, a very exciting time to be launching a brand and to be launching a new strategic plan and propelling this organization into the future. One of the data points that I always speak to in these meetings is our, if you want, macro assessment of how the organization's reputation is being assessed by those whom we serve. And there are many, many data points we use in the trust and satisfaction arena, but the 2 that I show on this slide here are the 2 important metrics that we measure every quarter, and you can see going back a few quarters now, both in terms of public trust and donor satisfaction, and these are a common set of questions that are asked by a third party on our behalf in each of these time periods, and you can see a consistent retention of very high scores, both for donor satisfaction in excess of 95% and public trust scores in the realm of 86% for the last survey, consistent if not slightly higher than previous surveys. An important data point just to point out for the board here is that the summer 2018 survey was done just before the launch of the brand, and so we actually are very keen to see what the next set of results show, whether the sort of brand launch and the work around the strategic plan does anything to further strengthen those scores of trust and satisfaction. And of course, we will continue to monitor that very carefully. The next couple of slides are really just meant to give some data on meeting patient needs for the various products and services, blood, plasma, stem cells, organs, and tissues. So I'm going to go through a couple of data points for each of the major life essentials. And this is, firstly, we'll focus on blood. On this slide here, what you're seeing in the blue and red bars combined is the amount of red cells that we ship to all of our customer hospitals on a quarterly basis, each quarter. So you can see data for 2.5 years here. And it's a little hard to tell given the size of the axis, but if you look at the size of the bar, there's actually a very slight decrease quarter over quarter over quarter, which is consistent with what we have reported to the board for some years now, that the demand for red cells continues to go down. It's very slight. It's on a quarterly basis, it's less than 0.5 percentage point, but we've seen declines around 2 to 3% per year for several years now. The other important line to look at is the red line, which shows how successful are we at fulfilling hospital orders first time they put an order to us. And you can see in the last 2 quarters, the period that I'm reporting for here, a significant uptick in our hospital order fill rate. And the reason for that is, and I'll come to another slide later on, we've had an extremely healthy inventory the past 6 months, much higher than we've seen for a long time before. And so we've had the ability to meet hospital orders essentially almost 100% of the time, which means every time they order what they want, they get from us without any other delays in delivery. And there's one other data point here, which unfortunately the slide doesn't really tell a very good story on, and that is the size of the red bar compared to the blue bar. And that's a measure we're monitoring very carefully because O-negative red cells, which are, if you want, the universal donor, is ticking up very slightly as a percentage of the overall red cells that we're shipping. So although the red cell shipments are going down, there's a slight uptick in the amount of O-negative red cells. And it's getting harder and harder to have enough donors who are O-negative to meet that hospital demand. The demand is considerably higher as a proportion of the population than we have a donor-based size in O-neg. So it's a measure that Rick's group pays very careful attention to. This slide is our ability to meet platelet demand, platelet shipments to hospitals. The point I want to make on this slide is if you look in the middle of 2017-18, the red bar suddenly drops quite a bit lower than it had been in the previous. And this is an intentional shift of our platelet production environment away from the apheresis platelets, the very expensive platelet collection, to rely more heavily on what are called whole blood pooled platelets or Buffy coat. You've heard us talk about Buffy coat platelets. And that is an intentional shift in our strategy to rely more on the platelets we get off our whole blood units, which are certainly less expensive, equally efficacious, and in some ways actually regarded to be an even safer or superior product to apheresis platelets. And so this organization has made an intentional shift to rely more heavily on our pooled platelets and help. That's one of the major contributors to our efficiency measure. And it's very important that I also remind us all what we do on the safety front. And there are 2 data points I want to speak to here. This summer, we saw a very busy West Nile season in Canada. And as the board knows, we've been testing for West Nile virus for many years now, since 2003. And this is our 2nd busiest year of activity. Glenda will remember very well when West Nile first emerged in Canada. It really hit Saskatchewan and the prairies very, very hard. It is still the dominant region where the virus occurs, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and mostly Ontario. This year, we had 43 donors test positive, which is way higher than the last number of years. All of those donors, of course, we interdicted the positive unit by the testing that we do, so the units never got transfused. That's the most important point. And then we also have to, when we get a positive donor, we then launch what is called single unit testing, so we amplify the type of testing that we do in that public health region where that donor donated, where that donor lives, because it's a signal that there's probably West Nile activity in that region. So we did more single unit testing this year than we've ever done before. It exceeded what we had budgeted for, but appropriately so. And then by end of October, the season came to an end, and we obviously don't test during the winter months. So I want to assure the public, assure Canadians, and obviously assure the board that the system worked very well this year with respect to West Nile, and it's a very important agent that we continue to test for. There is an emerging agent that we've certainly talked to the SRE committee before many times, and Margaret Fearon and Isra, and before Isra Dana, have talked to the committee and the board in the past about this agent known as Babesia. It's a pathogen that tends to occur in the northeast United States and in encroaching areas, particularly in Quebec, Ontario, and some of the maritime provinces. And we have been watching this as it relates to blood safety for some years now, as have our colleagues in the United States. And there's a lot of work going on to assess, is Babesia a threat to the blood supply, and should we do something about it? We did a study a couple of years ago, and we found no Babesia positives in our donor base. But we weren't satisfied with the scope and power of that study. So we expanded it to do a second study, and we collaborated with HEMA Quebec in this and the American Red Cross. So we did a tripartite study. We contributed 30,000 donors to that study. HEMA Quebec contributed 20,000. American Red Cross did some of their own, and they did some of the testing for us. And amongst the 30,000 that we tested, you can see on this slide, one donor tested positive by our sophisticated test called nucleic acid, which is when you're actually looking for the presence of the pathogen by the DNA of the agent. There were another 4 donors who had antibody positive, which means that they were probably previously infected, but they're not at risk of transmitting the infection. Somebody who is NAT positive is at risk of transmitting an infection. So we had 1 NAT positive. We then traced the recipients who had received the blood from that person, because this was not testing done in real time. None of the recipients got Babesia, so that's a very important factor. And we do know from studies in the US that it's not an easily transmitted agent. It can be transmitted by blood, but it's not universally transmitted. So we know that nobody got infection through the blood supply. But now what we're doing is we're taking our data, the Quebec data, the American data, and we're really running this through our risk-based decision-making framework to determine, is Babesia a threat to the blood supply in Canada? And if so, what should we do about it? It's not an easy answer, let's just implement a test at great cost. So we're going to do that, and we'll be back obviously with our own analysis and report on the results of the risk-based decision-making and whether we need to do anything about that.
This was discussed yesterday in the Safety, Research, and Ethics Committee that Anne chairs, and Isra reported to us that triggering the risk analysis now will come back to us. But Glenda, you wanted to pose a question.
Yeah, thanks. I just, because I wasn't at that committee yesterday, I was at one of the other committees, just wanted to understand, since this is the first time I've seen that we've actually had positive donors, what are the implications and what's the time frame? So you mentioned you'll be back to us with the risk assessment, so, and I guess I just wanted to understand this finding and what it might mean for us.
So I'll ask Isra to comment on the timing in one sec. I think this is an agent that the blood services, particularly in North America, have been monitoring for a very long time. We don't believe it's a large risk that requires immediate attention, but we don't know if it doesn't require something. So I think the important results that this study tells us more than the first study. The first study told us we had no positives, but we weren't assured by that data. So this tells us there is a potential risk, perhaps regional in Canada, not in the west and far east parts of the country. But we don't know how significant that is, and therefore how urgent our actions should be. Isra, the timing of the RBDM analysis?
Yeah, so we're still beginning the phase. So we're literally meeting this month. I think there was a meeting earlier this week with the investigators to begin plotting that out. So the timing is current. I would expect that the process will take several months, but I am, to Graham's point, the fact that we have a single positive now is not a surprise. We see the epidemiology in the Northwest United States or regions that are contiguous to Canada, And so not having seen it actually before was probably just that we weren't looking or that it's been tracking its way to us. The point here is actually this is the antibody and the antigen testing denominator was 50,000. So this is really one active case that is not associated with transfusion out of 50,000 tests. It's a very, very low rate, which is reassuring, but not surprising that we have it. And so to the timing question, it's current and imminent on next steps.
And if I can just add to that, I think the important issue for us needs to be what is a proportional response to the risk. I mean, it would be very easy to say, well, one positive, therefore we should test the whole blood supply. I mean, we could spend tens of millions of dollars and not gain any safety. I do also want to offer, though, an assuring message, which is, I think, the point that Ezra made. I don't think we should assume that there is widespread contamination in the supply. That's perhaps the most important message.
We will not make policy based on anecdote, but on the airplane coming up here, I was watching a Nova television program, and the guy was collecting ticks, and he talked about Babesia, and previously I'd only ever heard of it in board meetings. But obviously this is something that is crucial. You made the point yesterday, Ezra, that 1 in 50,000, although that's what we found, doesn't mean that you can simply ramp up. And do you want to just explain the incidence question?
Yeah, it's really a question of regional and seasonal rates. So we need to better understand the entomology of the tick, the epidemiology of it, and that will help us direct any future testing strategy that we might contemplate to areas where it might actually yield a reasonable result in terms of improving the safety that we would be striving for. So if we have prevalence of the disease in certain parts of the country, testing donors from other parts of the country wouldn't be applicable.
So we'll stay. Sorry, Judy.
I just thought I'd add and put some of this discussion in context. As was previously presented to the board and to the National Liaison Committee as well, there was a full risk-based decision-making analysis done, and certainly to show kind of the cycle of that process. We always knew that if we saw certain triggers, that we would delve back into that analysis, use all of the information we had gained to date, and then kind of do the reassessment of the risk. We've also been working really closely with American colleagues on the same type of process. So it really is the middle of the story as opposed to the beginning. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that reminder. All right, so talked a little bit about blood. I'll go to plasma now. And as Mel said, this is obviously an important conversation that has occupied an enormous amount of time for this organization, both at management and board tables for a very long time. So I want to give you a few sort of status points and then also a couple of data slides. So of course, in terms of our role in plasma, we collect plasma. Most of the plasma that we have available to us today is plasma that is taken off the whole blood units that we collect, known as recovered plasma. And we have a very small amount of source plasma, or plasma that we collect in an apheresis procedure from donors. But that combined volume of plasma that we have available has to serve two purposes. Firstly, we have to meet the needs for transfusion patients. These are patients who receive essentially raw plasma. We meet that need 100% in this country. We're completely sufficient in that. And all our remaining plasma is then directed for fractionation to make the primary product is immune globulin. That's the one that really is dominating all of the conversations. We also make albumin, and we can make other proteins as well from our plasma, but the one that is driving the conversation is Ig. And so, as I'll show you a couple of data points in a moment, but our objective is to collect significantly more source plasma because we're maxed out at recovered plasma. There's no more plasma to get off our whole blood. We're at 100% of the capacity there. Every unit of whole blood that we collect, we extract plasma from. So now the question is, what can we do to increase source plasma? And as Mel emphasized, the principles on which we're doing this is the altruistic unpaid donor model as per our ministerial principles and the MOU. And then we have to make sure we can meet patient needs for these plasma derivatives. And the one that we're most focused on is IG. And the reason it's the one we're most focused on, and the board is completely seized of this issue, as I stand here today, we're only 14% sufficient in terms of the amount of IG that we meet for Canadian patients, meaning 86% of the IG products that we buy comes from a foreign-sourced product. And I just want to remind us all and level set this conversation. Our objective is not to have 100% of IG made from Canadian plasma. We've always articulated the rationale for a balanced security of supply, meaning we will rely on the very important global market for IG to some extent, but we do believe we need to be much more self-sufficient than 14%. And if we did nothing, if we remained in the status quo environment, that 14% would be 10% within 2 or 3 years from now. And so that, in our view, is a high-risk position for a country to be in. And so how do we reverse that trajectory and get the 14% number back to a much higher number, giving us greater security of supply for Canadian patients? So what's driving it? This is the slide that answers that question. I've presented this to the board many times before. But what you're seeing here, just look at the size of the stacked bars, the red and the black together. Essentially, that is the total volume of IG being delivered into the marketplace on an annual basis. And currently, we're delivering just around 6 million grams of IG to Canadian patients, including the likes of Mike, and including from many of the patient groups you're going to hear from later this morning, whose lives depend on adequate supply of IG. And that growth rate is somewhere in the order of 7 to 10% per year, and there's no evidence that it's going to go down. And as a result, you can see the sufficiency line, which is the blue line, has declined from 21% only a few years ago to currently 14%. And if we do nothing, it will go rapidly down below that. So what are we doing in the immediate term? Is what can we do within our existing infrastructure? So we've looked at the locations where we do apheresis plasma collection, and up until recently, we used to collect plasma from donors to a maximum volume of 500 milliliters for every donation. We made a submission to the regulator to change that process, and we now collect in our London and Calgary plasma donor centers, we now collect up to 880 mils from every donor. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound like a great deal, but within a very limited infrastructure that exists there, now you see that we can collect a couple thousand liters more this year than forecast. And just by doing this in our existing plasma centers, this will contribute several thousands of liters over the next number of years. So it's just scratching the surface, I recognize that, but it's a very important shift we made within our existing infrastructure. And of course, as the board knows, and we spend a great deal of time talking about, where we need to go is to implement, as Mel described it, this program called a proof of concept program, where we will open 3 source plasma collection sites across the country from non-remunerated donors to demonstrate to ourselves and very importantly to our funding governments that we can generate large volumes of source plasma collection in a cost-effective manner in the Canadian context under the Canadian Blood Services brand for the purposes of manufacturing IG to greater enhance that sufficiency number and therefore also be responsible contributors to the global market. This is not about being entirely reliant on a single source from the United States. And so we are in very active discussions now, both obviously with our funding governments, as we've said to the board, also with the commercial plasma collection industry, and with our colleagues in Quebec and Australia and in other countries who are doing much as we're doing, and in some cases are considerably further ahead than we are. So that's the plasma collection part of the program, but of course we then also deliver plasma protein products into the marketplace, and you are going to hear from several patient representatives later this morning who represent some very important groups that either do receive or are seeking to have plasma derivatives or their alternatives listed on our formulary. And we will address a number of those issues as the questions get raised by the public presenters later this morning. I just want to remind the board that the current formulary we operate has 45 brands on formulary, and what is most important is the size, scale, and complexity of the formulary is changing. There are novel products emerging. You will hear some of the patient groups speak to the nature of the novel products emerging. There are a number that are under review as we speak, and several that are in the pipeline for consideration to be reviewed for appropriateness of being listed on our formulary. On a dollar basis, of course, the board knows this is by far and away the largest part of our total revenue every year, and the costs of this program are driven by a multitude of factors: product demand, pricing that we can negotiate, foreign exchange rates, since most of this is denominated in US dollars, and the mix of products available in our inventory. So this is a very large and growing program, and I think it's the complexity of the world. The nature of these products is very different today than it was 15 years ago, when there was a limited number of products available and there weren't many alternatives or novel therapies emerging, such as you're going to hear about shortly. So what are the two products that I thought I would highlight in addition to the IG data that you saw on the previous slide? This is the product used to treat patients with hemophilia A, and you're going to hear from David Page and the Canadian Hemophilia Society later. But Factor VIII is the primary product that patients who have hemophilia A are dependent on. They are deficient in Factor VIII, and so there's several types of products available. The traditional products used to be plasma-derived Factor VIII. In other words, it was made from human plasma. In the last 2 decades or so, there have been what are called recombinant Factor VIIIs, meaning these are synthetically engineered, but the molecule is essentially a like-for-like to the plasma protein. And then more recently, there were some innovations to extend the half-life of the product, which simply means that when you inject it into a patient, it stays around in the circulation longer, so the patient needs to infuse themselves less often than on a short life, half-life product. And so you can see in the last few years, there's been a bit of a mix, a bit of a blend in the nature of the products that we provide. And in 2018-19, you can see that the proportion of extended half-life Factor VIII molecules is higher than it has been in previous years. But you can see the total bars continue to edge up slightly, about 3 to 5% per year.
Graham, do you just want to, so I understand, the 3 different kinds of Factor VIII, are they all, I understand why the teal bar is, that product is more effective, in effect, staying in the system longer. But what are the cost differentials, price differentials? Very
good question, and of course, I can't disclose actual prices, but when the extended half-life therapies came on the market, this offers a dramatic improvement in quality of life, because a hemophilia patient has to inject himself less often than he would with a standard half-life product. So it's a quality of life benefit, dramatic quality of life improvement. And when they first came on the market, the question was, are they going to be significantly more expensive because of the innovation to deliver these products? Or at the sort of total cost of care level, will the therapy be more or less equivalent? So a unit of Factor VIII might be more expensive, but if I have to use less of it, the total cost of the delivery of the care should be more or less equivalent. And we've certainly sought to achieve that, and I think actually we have more than achieved that. So now, with our recent rounds of procurement, we have good pricing on the extended half-life product. We also have very good pricing on the recombinant product, because that was a debate 20 years ago: is recombinant therapy much more expensive than plasma-derived therapy? So actually today there's a closer blend of prices amongst the different products than there was when they first came on the market. And when David Page from the Hemophilia Society presents to us later, he's going to raise another question. So, David, I won't steal your thunder, but it's sort of now we're into the fourth generation, if I can call it that, of hemophilia product. There are these new monoclonal antibodies being developed, completely different type of therapy. And so the question is, what does it offer in terms of improved quality of life and cost effectiveness? Because maybe on a gram for gram comparison, it's a more expensive molecule, but if you use less and if there's fewer hospitalizations needed, you have to look at the total cost of care. So it's becoming increasingly complex from that point of view, Mel, but the short answer is the novel products, the extended half-life, are less expensive now than they were when they first came onto the market, which is sort of fairly typical for these innovative products.
Graham, could you explain what plasma-derived factor VIII is currently being used for in Canada and what the future of that is in our system? Thanks.
Sure, and you can see it varies slightly from year to year as to what proportion. There are some, and the science has changed from time to time around do patients, newly treated hemophilia patients, do better with plasma-derived factor VIII or recombinant factor VIII in terms of the risk of developing inhibitors. And that science has changed a little bit over time, and I think the most recent evidence would suggest actually that starting newly treated patients, they're called PUPs, previously untreated patients, on plasma-derived may in fact lower the risk of degenerating factor VIII inhibitors. So it's some of those patients get it. It can also be a patient preference issue or a physician preference issue. There are some patients who simply do better on that product than a recombinant. But as you can see in Canada, the large majority of patients are getting recombinant therapies, the red and the teal bars, and a very small percentage are getting plasma-derived. In some other countries, particularly in developing countries, it's almost all plasma-derived because it's less expensive. So it's probably driven by physician and patient preference and the state of science at any point in time, Kevin. The other drug that I thought I would just highlight, I'm obviously not going to speak to all the drugs on the PPP formulary, but the other one that is generating a significant amount of discussion between ourselves and the funding governments, and again, you are going to hear from the hereditary angioedema community shortly, so I won't steal their story either, but C1 esterase is a drug that treats patients with hereditary angioedema, and there will be a sort of explanation as to that patient group. This is a drug that only got onto our program, our formulary, a few years ago, and just look at the dramatic growth year over year. So it's the rate of rise of the red bars, or simply shown on the blue line. You can see about a 25 to 35% year-over-year growth in the use of C1 esterase to treat patients previously undiagnosed or previously without access to therapy. And there are now also novel therapies coming along to treat patients with HAE. And so this is going to be one of those challenging areas for formulary management, is what is an appropriate use of these expensive therapies, and most importantly, what is the accurate demand forecast? And so we're obviously in discussions with manufacturers of these drugs, with the patient and physician communities, to try to understand what we could project is an appropriate annual growth in demand until patient need is met. And it's somewhat difficult to understand that because there is a large cohort of patients who are either undiagnosed or underdiagnosed or not on appropriate amounts of therapy. So again, you will hear from the HAE community and some of their concerns, but I think the data is important for us to appreciate that this is a drug that is growing at very high rates. And obviously we see that in the budget discussions every year with the provinces, because this reflects obviously a significant contribution to our annual increases in plasma protein product questions.
So Graham, in the state of IVIG, because it's been used over time, the provinces and territories seem to have at least good utilization management and is appropriate. But in this drug, what's the status of maturity of that? I mean, how well are they managing giving the appropriate use because of the significant rises?
I don't know the answer to that, Jeff. And again, I'm going to ask that we can listen to what the HAE community will present to the board, because I think they have a very important narrative to share with us. Part of the issue here is we don't actually know the size of the patient population that requires it. We know how many are obviously being treated now, but there is a sense that it's an underdiagnosed entity. What is appropriate therapy? What's the appropriate dosing? I think this is still way newer, obviously, than IG for some patient groups. And this is not uncommon. This is not an uncommon trend. It's not alone in Canada that we're seeing this. This is a group of patients for whom therapy is relatively new, and I think part of it is the unknown as to how large is the cohort. Isra, I don't know if you can add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I think you've summed it up.
So, Jeff, it's something we will be back to the board as we better understand the drivers for demand here and the opportunities for utilization management. So I just use those three drugs, IG, Factor VIII, and C1, to really make the point that we have a complex formulary that we're managing. We obviously, as the board knows well, we acquire these products through a competitive procurement process. We do have patient and prescriber involvement in that procurement process. Some of the decisions we make, as we did in our last RFP, did result in patient transition requirements. And I will state right up front that our objective is to minimize any disruption to patient care as we work with patients, physicians, and treating institutions, as well as the vendors on transitioning patients. But you will hear certainly from Whitney and the Immunodeficiency Patient Organization that they have some concerns that the transition, certainly the most recent one, didn't necessarily meet all of those objectives to their satisfaction, and this is something we're committed to obviously paying very careful attention to at any point in time from a transition point of view. I'm going to jump then to stem cells, and of course the board knows we manage a sort of a dual component stem cell program. We run the registry for adult donors, and we now manage a national cord blood bank where we collect, store, and distribute cords for stem cell transplantations. We also provide human leukocyte antigen testing for a variety of programs across the country, including for our own labs. And to remind us all that our stem cell program and cord bank is linked to the global market. Why is that important? This is a busy slide, but there's two key messages I want to just talk to. If you just look at the blue-red bar stacks, you can see in the last few quarters the total number is up, except for Q2 of this current fiscal year. But generally, for the last 5 or 6 quarters, the demand for stem cell transplants in Canada is going up. More Canadian patients are receiving stem cell transplants. And what you can see, the dominant bar is the teal bar, which is still the largest source of stem cells for unrelated transplants in Canada, comes from international donors. We are still not meeting the large majority of stem cell transplant requirements in this country from our registry or our cord bank. And that's because in our registry we have 450,000 donors. Globally, we have access to over 26 million donors, or I think it may even be 30 million at this point. So we have access to a huge number of donors, potential donors for stem cell patients, and if we can't find a match in Canada, we have the ability to search registries right around the globe. What's also important on this slide is just that little number at the bottom. Our stem cell program does also contribute to global demand. And you can see in Q1 and Q2, we enabled 40 donors, Canadian donors from our registry to support international patients. So not only do we bring product in, but we also provide product to the global stem cell programs. And we also, of the 17 cord blood units that we've sold, 9 of them have gone to patients outside of Canada. Here's the other important message on our stem cell program, and this and the next 2 slides tell a very important message. In the adult registry, which has been growing for many years now, you can see that about 2/3 of the registry is still Caucasian, so it's very heavily weighted to Caucasian donors, and less than 1/3 are non-Caucasian, which is of course not reflective of Canada today. When we built the cord blood bank, by design, we really targeted pregnant women of non-Caucasian origin heavily in order to better represent that proportion of Canadians. When you break down the 2 teal pieces of apple pie, you get the next two slides. So this is the adult registry, and you don't need to read the small font. It's the size of the boxes that I want to speak to. And the most important one is the one that has a labeling called multiple ethnicity. The adult registry, so the hardest patients to find a stem cell transplant for are patients who are of mixed ethnicity. So mom and dad may come from different heritages, and so the child has mixed ethnicity. And since tissue types are inherited along ethnic lines, these will be the hardest patients to match in a transplant. So you can see in our adult registry, only about 10% of the donors are identified as mixed ethnicity. Whereas look at the cord blood composition, and this was by strategic design. We targeted mums who were of, so mom and dad came from different backgrounds, and the child was therefore, the cord sample was therefore deemed to be of multiple ethnic backgrounds. And you can see that of the total non-Caucasian, almost half of them are multiple ethnicities or mixed ethnicities. And this is a very important gap we're trying to close, is to find product for patients who come from mixed ethnic backgrounds. So I think the important message I'm trying to get across is the design of the CORD program was strategic in terms of trying to deliver a different ethnic composition than we've been able to do in the adult registry. We're doing the same in the adult registry, but there's a lot of history behind that registry that doesn't have diversity built into it. Just a couple of quick numbers on CORD, and you'll stop me if you need to. It's a busy slide, but if you just look at the right-hand column total, so we've collected about 21,000 samples altogether. About 3,500 are bankable, means they pass all the criteria and have been listed on the registry and listed internationally for sale, and 17 products to date have been utilized, 9 internationally and 8 for Canadian patients.
You want to just describe what happens to so if you have 3,000 that are, 3,300 that are bankable, what happens to the rest?
So we have a CORD for research program where we will so if we collect a unit, but it doesn't pass certain quality criteria for banking, because we only bank material of very high quality, it's got to have a certain cell count and it's got to have certain characteristics to be a viable stem cell. If it doesn't pass those criteria, we will make it available to the research community, because researchers across this country are always looking for products for stem cells, always looking for stem cell products for research purposes. So we have a large, what we call CORD for research program, where we make it available. And if it's not utilized then, through that either, it can potentially be destroyed if it's not going to be banked or utilized for research purposes. Anne.
So I find that this is a very interesting subject. And with things like blood, we can set goals for ourselves that will meet our national needs. But in this case, we would never, I'm going to ask the question, but I don't think we would set a goal that we want to be 100% self-sufficient, because we have an ethnically diverse population, and we always know that we'll be looking internationally. So in the absence of being able to set that kind of goal for ourselves, what kind of goals are we setting with respect to the numbers we want to collect?
So 2 components to that question. No adult registry or CORD bank in the world, in any country, will meet all of those domestic needs. It's simply not possible. So even in the United States and even in Germany, which have by far and away the world's largest adult registries, and probably, well, certainly the United States has by far and away the largest inventory of cord material bank, even they will import products from time to time, and some of the ones that we've shipped to the United States. So it is, given the diversity of human tissue types, it's simply impossible for any one country to meet needs. And that's why these adult registries and these cord banks have all linked, and there's a global, control of the inventory. We can all belong to a network, the World Maradona Association, which allows all samples to be listed internationally, and everyone can search the totality of the globe's availability. Even then, there will be patients who can't find a suitable match. And that's, if you ask me what is the one thing we should always be measuring, is how many patients in Canada will forego a transplant because there is no match of any sort available. And of course, you would like that number to be as close to zero as possible. Any country would like that. And there is also a shift in how stem cell transplants are being done. They're now even using half-matched material to try to increase the number of patients who have access to transplant. So it's a complicated area, Anne, and it's an important question you ask. And I may not have answered it completely, but I would say it's not a measure of domestic sufficiency like we talk about in plasma or blood, because I don't think that that's the important measure. It's more about, can the system support patient care irrespective of the source of the stem cell product? Because global diversity of tissue types is just so complicated. And it's getting more complicated with the diversity of countries.
Thanks for this, Graham. It is very helpful. Can you just help me understand, are these two sources of stem cells, from adult donors or from cord blood, are they equal in terms of who would receive those, or are there certain kinds of patients who would be appropriate for one and not the other? And what sort of mix do you look for between those two sort of sources of stem cells?
They're not equal at all. So cord blood material traditionally would be much more used in pediatric transplants than in adult transplants. There are some adults where there are enough stem cells in a cord blood unit that could potentially be viable for transplanting into that adult patients. But more typically, because the number of stem cells in a cord donation is lower than the number of stem cells you can collect from an adult, so typically it would support a smaller patient, therefore a pediatric patient. That's one dimension by which it differs. There are many others, clinical factors, that a physician or a transplant center might prefer a cord unit over an adult donor unit, or an adult donor unit over a cord unit, just because of either the treatment practices available at their transplant centers. There's lots of transplant centers in Canada and around the world that have not really adopted cord banking, a cord blood stem cell transplant, because it does take longer for those products to engraft. The patients are in isolation for longer. So there are different treatment center protocols is certainly a factor that provides for different demand. And as I briefly mentioned, and just to make the whole universe more complicated here, now transplant centers are beginning to use what are called haploidentical. So meaning I'm only half matched to the recipient. So that means it could be a sibling or a parent could be a match when they can't find a perfectly matched unrelated donor. And that's a new type of therapy enabled by new chemotherapy and anti-rejection drugs. It certainly wasn't around when I was doing stem cell transplants 20 and 25 years ago. So that's now thrown a whole spanner in the works of the demand for cord and even adult stem cell donors. So it's become a pretty complicated arena. Craig?
Graham, who gets to access the registry for these stem cells? In the media, there's stories about little clinics popping up offering to treat people's various problems with stem cells with dubious purposes in mind. So we belong to this international registry. We're an active part of it, and presumably people can access what we have in storage. What are the controls on all this?
So, I mean, Israel and others can help here, but I just think we need to be, so that's an important question, because we need to distinguish stem cells in the lay media from what we're talking about here. The products that we have either in our cord bank or available through our adult donors are what we would call hematopoietic stem cells. These are stem cells for transplant for patients who typically have a bone marrow or an immune disorder, leukemia, lymphoma, some sort of immune disruption to their body, and they would have what in the old days used to be called a bone marrow transplant. Is now called a stem cell transplant. But these are blood-forming stem cells, hematopoietic stem cells. What you hear a lot about in the lay media, and is an innovative part of the practice of medicine, you can get stem cells injected into your knee and into your back and into your eye and into your liver for all sorts of novel therapy. There are stem cell therapies that are potentially being experimented and developed for a whole slew of conditions that are not bone marrow-related conditions. And there's a multitude of studies going on around the world in a broader field of cell therapy than just hematopoietic cell transplant. So that's what you'd read a lot about. So, you know, a pop-up clinic that is infusing stem cells into inflamed knee joints would not be accessing our bank. These would be accredited or, you know, recognized transplant centers in major institutions, either in Canada or around the globe. So it's a very important issue, Craig, and we will, obviously, as part of our strategy, we've articulated the need to understand the emerging world of cell therapies, because some of these cells could be engineered to be used for different stem cell therapies in the future. I mean, there are many exciting, novel stem cell therapies that are going to change the practice of medicine, that is beyond the traditional bone marrow transplant world. What I've talked about here is really the traditional one, and I think we need to understand what's going to happen in the stem cell and cell therapy world.
Tomorrow, the board will be visiting the Concourse Gate site, and we'll see the cord bank. I know, David, you've seen it, and so have I. It's very impressive to see the technology of storage and tracking and traceability. But when those stem cells are recovered and then shipped abroad, I don't want to make this into simply a transaction, but it's costly to preserve. And we recover some cost, or we don't recover any cost?
We do, and there's a sort of a globally agreed upon transaction fee. You know, you might say it's a price attached to a unit of cord. So when we import a cord product, or when we sell a cord or a stem cell product, there is a globally agreed transaction fee that is really meant to offset most of the costs. And it's many thousand, I think it's around 40 or 50,000? $40,000 per product. So it's you know, whether it completely offsets all the cost is because there's many components in the cost, but that's really a service transaction fee that is agreed upon between the donation center and the receiving transplant center.
The provinces are essentially giving us the money to manage the system.
Right. And so when we looked at the financials the other day, Pauline reported on a slightly increased revenue in the stem cell program this past year. And what was driving that is we actually sold more onto the international market than we had forecasted. So it gives us a little bit of a revenue boost. But of course, there's also the costs of bringing product in. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this slide. It just tells you that the quality of the material we bank in our cord bank is very high, and it's been by strategic design. I'll jump into organs and tissues. You heard from Everett on the right of this picture at our last board meeting. He also works at Canadian Blood Services. I don't know if he's in the room or hanging on the rafters, a heart transplant recipient, and Heather, who's actually a kidney donor, a liver donor. I wanted to start with this metric, and I have a data point to talk to on the next slide. We know that, and we use this number all the time, there are about 4,500 Canadians today waiting for an organ transplant. We also know that about 260 Canadians die every year waiting for an organ transplant. And David and others have prompted us to better understand what we're doing to deal with that issue and reduce the number of patients dying on wait lists. This is a slide that Amber Appleby from ISRA's group put together for us, and I wanted to make the point here. So you look at several countries, the US, Spain, UK, Canada, and Australia. These are countries we do a lot of benchmarking with in the organ donation world. Spain and the United States have by far and away the most integrated and successful organ donation programs globally, measured by the number of donors per million population. So I'll show you another slide where you will see the US and Spain as world leaders in the number of organ donors per million population, and therefore the number of transplants per million population. And yet, even in those countries, they still have very high wait lists per million population. So the other important point around this slide is every country defines a wait list differently. Who's on a wait list? Who comes off a wait list? I only wanted to put this slide up to show that while we still have a wait list of 4,500 Canadians, all countries have wait lists of similar or even higher numbers measured in a per million population, so normalized for the size of the population. I'll come back to that in a sec. Just to remind the board, we do a lot of work in the organ donation space about developing leading practices and knowledge creation. Just some examples in the last 6 months shown on this slide here. We saw a very tragic but also inspiring outcome following the Humboldt bus accident in Saskatchewan. This was widely reported in the media that one of the 16 individuals killed, Logan Boulay, had shared with his family literally weeks before the accident his intent to donate his organs. So his family knew this, and they acted on this. And as was reported widely in the media, his organ donation that his family enabled went to 6 separate recipients across the country. And not only that, but we saw an uptick in the number of organ donor registrants by over 100,000 just as a result of this single act. So it just reminds us, and then many of the folk in Saskatchewan came into some of our blood donor centers there and just sort of spontaneously held recognition events inspired by that terrible tragedy. This is the slide that shows the number of transplants that our kidney registries support. So as the board knows, we manage 2 registries on behalf of the provinces and territories and the transplant centers, the highly sensitized kidney registry and the kidney PED donation program, as well as a 3rd registry, which is for urgent status patients. And as you can see, as a result of the work we do in matching donors and recipients through our registries, in excess of 1,000 kidney transplants have been enabled since those registries began 8 years ago, and those are 1,000 patients who otherwise would not have had access to a kidney transplant because they couldn't have been matched to a suitable donor. This slide just shows you the total national uptick in organ donation in Canada since we started work in this field in 2008. The country has gone from about 15 to 21 donors per million population, which is about a 40% increase. So, and that's not purely as a result of CBS. Obviously, it's a collaborative effort nationally between ourselves, the transplant centers, and the organ donation organizations. But as a country, you can see we're moving in the right direction. And this is the slide that I referred to a minute ago. The 2 leaders in the world are Spain and the United States, the top 2 lines in the graph. And Canada is sort of in that pack there with Australia and the UK. All have seen significant improvement over the last few years, but all of us are still substantially behind the 2 world leaders. The board knows is that there was an evaluation of our ODT program undertaken by, on behalf of the Health Canada funding program. We've shared this with the board before. The outcome of the evaluation showed the program to be relevant, aligned with government priorities and federal roles, because the feds co-fund this, and it helped advance the stakeholder objectives in organ and tissue donation and transplantation. The report also called out, though, that there was confusion in roles and responsibilities amongst some players, including ourselves and some of the organ donation organizations in the provinces, and that better collaboration was needed. So I have to give credit to Health Canada that has now convened together with the provinces and territories and CBS really a tripartite effort to bring all the stakeholders together to identify what are those collaboration barriers that we as a country and an integrated system need to address. We were part of a 2-day workshop. Israel and his team were actively involved in this just a month ago, and coming out of that is a very significant, I would say, positive momentum forward for all participants in the complex ODT system to work together to further drive up that national data that we've seen. Seeing no questions, I'll just quickly jump ahead. You're going to hear from Dr. Pambram after the break, so I'm not going to talk much about our R&D program. She's going to give the board a much more comprehensive overview of the work that we do in our Center for Innovation. But in the last 6 months, there were a couple of big highlights that I'll just leave on the slide for a second. And the one I'll call out is that one of our scientists, Dr. Hae-Yu Ni, who works in Toronto, a CBS-funded scientist, received a $2.5 million foundation grant from CIHR, a very large grant, specifically to support his research on platelet function, which is his area of expertise. So one of the big achievements in the R&D group this last 6 months, plus many, many other outputs that are summarized on this slide. And then I'm going to jump from, so I've talked about sort of all the meeting patient needs. Now I'm going to talk about our relationship with donors across the various product and service lines. Just a couple of data points from the last 6 months. In the blood donor and stem cell world, we had about 120 events over the past 6 months that had a very intention diversity focus to them. You can see here 66 stem cell programs, events rather, and 50 blood donation events targeting very specific communities where we know we need better representation. And then just last week, Rick and his team hosted a very broad stakeholder consultation event in Toronto for 3 days to ask the question, what do we need to do to grow a more diverse donor base for all the products and services that we provide? And Rick, maybe just a quick summary of the event last week.
Yes, thank you, Graham. And yes, Board, I'm very pleased to report that it was a very successful exercise that we conducted. We had just over 40 people together in Toronto, almost half of whom came from diverse communities across Canada, to really help us establish a clear agenda for moving to a more diverse donor base across a range of dimensions. And quite apart from the 36 recommendations that the group brought forward, which are very practical and actionable, we established a firm commitment to engage with these communities to co-create solutions. So a very, very positive result. And we look forward to seeing the output of that over the next several months.
So we'll bring that back to the board as sort of part of the board's focus, as Mel said in his introductory remarks, on donor recruitment and retention. So it was a really great event. And a lot of work that Rick has talked to the board about on creating a valued donor experience. As the board knows, we received $7 million as part of our budget this year from the provinces and territories with a very specific focus on enhancing the donor experience. And I won't read everything that's on the slide, but essentially these are the areas of focus that run the gamut from technology, human touch, the work that we actually do on the collection centers, the work we do with donors before, during, and after a donation event to make sure we give them an excellent experience and retain them in the system. And so a lot of work that Rick has previously talked to the board about and will keep you apprised of. This slide does address one of the strategic focuses that the board knows we're working on. It's our shift to digital. And you can see that the number of appointments month over month for the last year and a bit continues to increase. Appointments built using a web self-serve or digital channels. So whether this is the enhancements to our app, the enhancements to our new website as a result of the brand launch, which is very prominently donor-facing, or several other changes underway, you can see now a significant uptick. And for the first time ever now, the majority of all of our appointments are booked using digital channels, whether it's the app or the web or self-serve in our collection centers where donors can use the technology we now make available to them. In terms of reaching Canadians by a messaging point of view, the board knows that we've changed our focus rather than sort of the routine messages and then from time to time these big appeals when product gets short. We've changed and had a more controlled approach to messaging Canada for potential donors. We call it our periodic elevated messaging. And I just wanted to point out on this slide that 4 times this year we have gone out with elevated messaging, usually in anticipation of a period when we know blood donation is going to be low. It could be the sort of long weekend periods or vacation periods. And so these are very targeted periods. And typically we expected around a 2,500 donation lift. And you can see in our last one in August, we had a dramatically higher lift in donations after that set of elevated messaging than we had seen in the first 3. We're not 100% sure why. It was also a slow news week, so our elevated messaging got significantly more replay than we had anticipated or seen in the previous 3. And that has been the one reason why we're sitting on this enormously healthy inventory, because we had such a large boost in our donation following the August elevated messaging. And obviously the intent now is to convert all of those donors into retained donors. You don't want them to be one time. So Rick has a whole lot of work focused, and it was shown on the previous slide, around donor retention strategies to keep these donors engaged. I'll just move on, Mel, in the interest of time, but please stop me. So in terms of organizational excellence, a few slides here. There's a lot of numbers on this slide, but it just summarizes our productivity and efficiency goals. And as the board knows, we have many activities in the organization focused on achieving elevated levels of productivity and efficiency using the ABO, the Alliance of Blood Operator benchmark numbers. And the column I would just draw your attention to is the right-hand column. So you can see since 2015, across the recruitment, collection, production, and testing functions, we've seen significant gains in productivity, anywhere between 13 and as high as a 60% improvement in productivity in the testing arena using a standardized ABO benchmark measure, as well as an improvement in our discard rates, and this is reported regularly to the SRE committee in terms of the work we're doing to drive down the number of units that are discarded. Infrastructure is a huge part of our work, as the board knows, and I thought I would just show you a current photo, well, almost current photograph of the new facility in Calgary. Construction will be substantially complete by May, and then we go, of course, into the validation phase and making sure the building meets all the standards, and that's a very long and important phase to do the necessary validation checks, and we should have full occupancy by sometime late in 2020. I thought I would just call out that in addition to building a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility, we also took a very purposeful approach from a design point of view to make this a green-friendly building and sought LEED certification. And in fact, we are going to achieve gold certification. And the reason for that is, for example, there are 160 solar panels on the roof of this building, which will deliver 25% of all of our power needs on a daily basis, amongst many other things that were built in to make this a very friendly, green-friendly building. Of course, it's not just about building a new building in Calgary, because in the west we're also upgrading our Edmonton facility. We have migrated production from Regina into Calgary, and that will go into the new facility as well. And there's a lot of other changes underway as part of the total infrastructure renewal in Western Canada. The board knows, and I thought I would just report here, our focus on cybersecurity. This is a very extensive part of our strategy. There was a long discussion and an important discussion at the Finance Committee yesterday, so I won't go into a lot of details other than to highlight that in the last quarter, or the last 6 months rather, there were no significant incidents. That does not mean there were no penetration attempts. There were, and there are all the time, but our defenses and our mechanisms continue to protect the network and the system. And the board knows, and this was the discussion at the committee, there was an internal audit done of our cybersecurity universe, and essentially the audit summarized that the controls and procedures are in place and well designed, but offered a number of recommendations to enhance them. A big initiative that is in the process of concluding as we speak is the migration of our data centers. This cartoon just shows you that we used to have, or we still do have, data centers in this building and just up the road in our Lancaster facility. And this has been a sort of an infrastructure weakness for us for some years now. And we shared with the board a couple of years ago our intent to modernize our data center environment and move to hosted data centers geographically remote. So you can see it's hard to read, but we will have a data center in Toronto, a data center in Calgary, so you then deal with geographic risk. And these will be hosted by professional data center managers, so we will not be in the business of managing the infrastructure. We will own the servers and the content of that, but we won't be worrying about heating and cooling and all of the vitally important attributes of a data center in the 21st century. So that's a big project that's coming to close. Quality, of course, the board knows we do a lot of work on quality, and I just summarized the data here. The Q2 performance for the second quarter of this year, we exceeded targets in all of the 8 measures in our quality index, and we have now done that for several quarters in a row. And so we continue to see positive gains in our quality arena as a result of all the work we're doing. I thought I would just call out, it's a busy slide, this one, but the board knows, and the SRE committee has received lots of discussion from Christiane about our corrective and preventive action program. This is a fundamental underpinning of a quality management system. And what this slide basically tells the board is that you have seen the number of CAPAs that are opened each quarter go down, and that's because we are solving problems, and our timeliness to respond to those has gone up, particularly in the last couple of quarters, as a consequence of putting in the CAPA specialists that I know Christiane has spoken to the committee about before. And I thought I would show this data point. We had this result in the last couple of months, and so it's appropriate for this mid-year review. But Christiane's team worked with external service providers to assess the quality mindset or the quality culture inside Canadian Blood Services using a benchmark that many, many other organizations use. And I think there were over 130 companies in this benchmark and over 300,000 individual respondents to a standardized instrument. And in our organization, I think almost 800 people took the survey. And what does it tell you? It tells you that Canadian Blood Services is within the top quintile, so the top 20% of the overall benchmark. And what is really interesting when you unpack some of the data, right around us are some pharmaceutical manufacturing companies. So I think that's important. Now, we would like to be higher up in that quintile. As you can see, we're right on the dividing line between the top and the second quintile. And obviously, we would like to be higher up on this culture score. But it was our first time ever doing this, and it did give us, for the first time, a benchmark as to how does this organization assess itself from a quality culture compared to other industries participating in a similar tool. Lots of work in our operating environment on driving continuous improvement, and these are just a few examples here. And here you see a photograph of Mr. Hayashi from Japan, from the Toyota Motor Corporation, and he has been there since the 1960s and was one of the protégés of the founder of the Toyota production system, and he came to Brampton to offer his insights on the work we're doing, and as the board knows, we've been working with Toyota for many years. So I think, Rick, this was a proud day at work for you and your team, dare I say, and Toyota has been really just instrumental in helping us drive some continuous improvement work. Environmental footprint, we measure many things here, as the board knows, and just a couple of results to show you. This is an area where we need to do more work, but we are beginning to pay attention, and in our new strategy, we will have a particular focus on the environmental footprint of this organization. It's probably not in the right place, this slide, but just to remind the board and the public that we are working with our funding governments on establishing a new national accountability agreement, and there has been an enormous amount of work in the last 6 months that the board is aware of, and we are now in the midst of discussing a draft agreement with the board and with governments, and hopefully we will have a draft that all parties could consider signing in early 2019. Lots of other work going on with our governments on the organ donation front, as I mentioned, on the plasma front, and working on the selection process for our plasma products, which you will hear more about from our stakeholders in a moment. Lots of work inside the organization on our workforce, and here's just one of many examples, creating a digital work environment that is modern and reflective of the tools that our employees need. And here's just one example with a new employee portal launched coincident with the brand as well. And as the board knows, we have a very strong focus on diversity and inclusion. We committed to this. The board worked with us on this at the National Liaison Committee last time, and there's just some examples of the work in the last 6 months. And I think it's important from time to time to recognize that those who look outside into CBS actually grant us some recognitions. And 2 awards that the organization was successful in achieving in the last 6 months are shown on this slide here, and I think we should take some pride. We won a silver award for one of Canada's safest employers, and we were a gold winner in the health wellness leadership arena, and this was done, we applied to this category thanks to the work from Andrew's team, and recently, I think only last week or the week before, received notification. So I think these are important attributes to recognize. And I'll close, Mr. Chair, then with just a couple of data points on the financial status of the organization for the first 6 months. Of course, this was discussed in more detail at the Finance Committee, but I think it's important to talk about the financial health of the organization and not just the operating performance. So what does this slide show? The working capital is essentially unchanged in mid-year, September 2018, compared to the end of the fiscal year, March 2018. But there are actually many moving parts inside that. You can see that our operating cash has gone down by $7 million. Our accounts receivables have gone up by $8 million, and most of that is the ongoing issue with the Ontario government receivables. So they're higher in September than they were at March at year end. But I think it's also important to point out that this time last year, September 2017 results, Ontario's receivables were $79 million. So they make up the majority of those receivables there, not all, but it's significantly improved compared to this time last year. And look, for example, at inventory, there's a significant reduction in the inventory carrying costs, which is positive, and that obviously reflects the improved pricing of product we gained through our RFP last year. The board knows that we have had a tremendous amount of work in the last year, probably seems like 20 years, to address an important issue with our captive insurance program, and that is to increase the size of the primary layer, the red bar, from $250 million of capitalization to $300, and thereby reduce the member indemnification, which is the second layer, from $750 down to $700 million. And why have we been able to do that? Why have we been able to increase the capitalization and reduce the indemnity is really addressed on this slide here. So in September, the results for September show that the investments inside the captive insurance program are at about $470 million, so $7 million higher than year end, or about a 1.2% gain over the 6 months. I should point out that when you look at the life of the investment portfolio since inception, it's gained about 6.4% gross and about 6.2% net, which is ahead of benchmark. So the entire investment portfolio has beat benchmark since inception and is a very healthy investment portfolio. Inside the total coverage requirements of the captive, there's not just the $250 million for the primary policy, the blood liability policy, but as the board knows, we have other coverages. We have cyber coverage, we have transit and product coverage, we have contingent risk indemnity coverage, and then of course we also have to reserve for various statutory and market requirements. When you account for all the coverages and the reserves, we have something in the order of $90 million of premium net assets, meaning assets in the insurance investment portfolio in excess of all of the coverage requirements. And it's because that premium net asset is now in the ballpark of $90 million and growing that we were able to build a case for the provinces that we should take $50 million from that and apply it to the primary layer, thereby reducing government's indemnity in the secondary layer. Very complicated, but I think it's a very good news story, both for the insurance captive, for the purpose it serves of protecting those who may be harmed by the blood system, and of course reducing indemnity on governments. Quickly, a word on capital assets. You can see that it's increased by $13 million since the end of the fiscal, and you can see some numbers that are contributing to that, about $23 million more of capital assets, but this is offset by $10 million in amortization. So about a $13 million increase from March to September in the capital assets. And the very last slide is this one, which just shows on a 6-month or year-to-date period comparing September 17 to where we are September 18. You can see that our total expenditures have gone down for the same 6 months by about $25 million. So this time last year, $612 million, now $588. And you can see some of the reasons why total expenditures are lower than this time last year. $15 million reduction in the cost of plasma products, as a result of the lower product prices, $2 million reduction in staff costs due to some projects coming to an end and some changes in the stem cell program, reduction in medical supplies because the demand goes down, and a positive gain in foreign exchange as a result of our hedging program. So what was a $2 million loss last year is a $3 million gain on foreign exchange hedges this year to give us essentially a $5 million benefit in expenditures. And so, Mr. Chair, I've talked a lot and thrown a lot at you as I do at these presentations, but I would summarize the 6 months performance this way. We're meeting, if not exceeding, collection targets, and we have a very solid inventory of blood. Our quality metrics continue to be met, and very good gains in our quality program, as well as in our productivity and efficiency initiatives. There is increasing diversity in our stem cell programs, which is an important part of our strategy. Lots of collaborative conversation with governments on a variety of files, not just organ donation, and all of this while we launched a brand and launched a new strategy. So it's been an interesting 6 months.
Thanks, Graham. Let me ask for the board if there are questions or comments. Dunbar?
Thanks, Graham, for a very informative presentation, and I do want to commend you and all the staff on a great first half of the year in terms of progress in numerous areas. My question is, as we move into the second half, what are the 3 top priorities that you and the team and the staff are focused on in terms of continuing this move forward?
Plasma, plasma, and plasma. No, not to make light of your question, Dunbar, plasma is certainly number one. We have a lot of work to do to get to the right position on launching our proof of concept site. So as the board knows, and both Mel and I have repeated many times now, this is dominating the airwaves at the management table and will continue to do so. So I would say that's certainly very high on the list. What I perhaps would add as the second is, given everything that is going on, and you can see the enormous amount of work going on in the organization, it is mission critical that we pay attention to the health and well-being of the workforce. So we cannot take our eye off all the employees, not just the 20 hanging over the banisters here, but the 4,000 across the organization who deliver these results that I can, in a privileged way, stand up here and talk about. But they are the folk who really drive all of these outcomes. And we need to pay attention to the health and well-being of our workforce. We, as the board knows, we do periodic surveys of our employees from an engagement and wellness point of view. And we just concluded a survey. We don't have all the detailed results analyzed yet. They are literally headline results coming in. Firstly, we had the highest ever response rate, so that's a positive. And when you just look at the headline result, which we still have to dig into deeply, the engagement score is actually higher than it was last time we did it. So I don't have more to speak about because we need to do the analysis, and we will bring that back to the board next time. But that's not something we can take our eye off the ball on. So I would put that very high up there. And I would say probably the third is then positioning ourselves as an organization. And let me just step back. Included in the employee wellness is the entire leadership team, including the executive team and all the leaders. We all need to pay attention to that. And then the third piece, Dunbar, I would say, is positioning the organization for success in launching the new strategy. So we've got this fabulous new brand, which is an enabler to our strategy. We've worked with the board for 18 months in developing a 5-year forward-looking strategy, and now we need to really do what is necessary to execute that. So what are the priority projects? What are the priority programs? Where is the funding and the resource allocation going to come from? Because otherwise we're at risk of having created a strategy and not be in a position to execute over 5 years. So I would say, both at the executive team and the broader organization, a lot of work over the next few months to get ready for keeping the promise, the strategy 2019 to 2024.